Well, hello, I'm Lee Barrett from what was known as Lancaster Theological Seminary and is now the School of Theology of Moravian University. This is the second of, no, I'm sorry, it's the third of a series on the religious roots of the American Revolution, which is something that usually doesn't get much attention, but they were profound. Before we get started, a question. How many folk here are former or current Catholics? Okay, well, we're going to talk about the evils of Catholicism today. And the way in which paranoia about Catholicism fed into the American Revolution. We've already talked about how fear of Episcopalianism was a factor. The fear that America would get its own bishop, and no longer would the Episcopal Church in the colonies be under the supervision of the Bishop of London, which was fine with everybody here because there's a 3-month sea voyage in between, so the bishop could not supervise things. But the fear was if a bishop were here physically in the colonies, that Episcopalianism would spread. And that scared the heck out of Presbyterianism, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and other non-Episcopal Protestants. So this, what we're going to talk about today, is somewhat similar, but even deeper. It was fear of Catholics that was endemic to every kind of Protestant in the colonies. And this might sound strange now, that Catholics would evoke so much terror in folk, but it wasn't so long ago that that was still the case. Some of you may remember the presidential campaign of John F. Kennedy and how his Catholicism was an issue. Fear was that he would take orders from the Vatican and betray American interests, and they would also promote Catholicism to the detriment of other religious traditions. I may have mentioned this before, but I love Kennedy's response to a question from a reporter who said, do you believe in papal infallibility? And Kennedy said, well, 2 months ago I had an audience with His Holiness and he kept calling me Bob. And think maybe 15, 20 years ago, the popularity of books by Dan Brown, like the Da Vinci Code, which the villains are routinely crazed Catholic monks or priests. And there's a cabal of Catholics to destroy the universe. Now, imagine that as recently as 15 years ago, that seemed plausible to a lot of people. Imagine if the religion had been changed and it was a cabal of crazed Presbyterians who were trying to take over the universe. That would not have been plausible to anybody. So the suspicion, well, I don't know, is there a cabal? Is that what you talk about in your session meeting? Anyway, and the anti-Catholic riots and almost street warfare that occurred in Boston and Philadelphia and New York and Baltimore in the 1840s and 50s with the nativists and the know-nothings during the first wave of Irish Catholic immigration into the country. So that fear of Catholics does run deep, and it's not entirely gone. And it goes back to, again, Henry VIII and the ambiguity of the English Reformation. And one of the main things, the only clear thing that Henry did was dissolve loyalty to the Vatican. He renounced papal authority. And he sold off a bunch of church property and made a fortune doing it. As so did the English aristocracy. Sold off monastic lands. If you've been to England, you probably see ruins of monasteries all over the place. So it was largely a political and economic thing. So folk in England, especially the Protestant nobility, and that was most of them, were scared silly that the Pope might somehow or other get control of England again and they'd have to give their stuff back. Now think of Masterpiece Theater in Downton Abbey. It's called an abbey for a reason. It was where a Catholic monastery had been. And imagine if, well, I forgot the family's name. The family had to give that back to the Roman Catholic Church. So that fear lingered, that if the Catholics get control of England, we're going to have to give all our stuff back. So that was terrifying. However, not everybody in England did become Protestant. There was a handful, particularly in Yorkshire. Think of all creatures great and small. For some reason, I'm filled with Masterpiece Theater allusions today. A lot of Catholics up there did not join the Church of England, which was dangerous because it was illegal not to. It was illegal in England after Henry VIII to be Catholic. But Catholics remained hidden. It was kind of an open secret. If you had a Catholic neighbor, you knew it. They couldn't worship in public, but what they did was have little chapels in their manor houses with a resident, usually a Jesuit priest, who would perform Mass and would live in a closet to stay out of sight of everybody. So if you travel around Yorkshire particularly and go into some old large country estates, they will probably show you the priest closet where a guy lived, and they usually are really just a closet where a priest lived and would perform the Mass surreptitiously. Everybody knew that, but there were enough of them, and they were powerful enough, wealthy enough, where the government generally looked the other way. So the Catholics were visited with benign neglect. But that changed somewhat in the early 1600s when some of those Catholics tried to blow up the king and Parliament. When the king was meeting in Parliament and they knew it, they put a bunch of gunpowder under the then buildings of Parliament, and it failed. They were caught and executed, of course. That's known as Guy Fawkes Day, which is still a big deal in England. And just as an aside, it was celebrated every, I think it's November 5th. It's a big anti-Catholic celebration with bonfires and fireworks. And it traveled to the United States, where the Puritans made a big deal out of Guy Fawkes Day, which was an anti-Catholic celebration, in which they would, in Boston particularly, they would have an effigy of the Pope, like a scarecrow dressed in papal garb. Then behind it, another scarecrow dressed as the devil, with horns and a tail. And they drag it through the streets. There were actually two of them, one in North End and one in South End. And there would be hundreds of people marching along with it. And they'd get drunk and they'd celebrate in the street. And then at the end of the evening, they'd light the Pope on fire. And actually then go to people's houses and ask, "Are you a Catholic?" And of course in Boston, the answer was always no. They said, "Well, you're not a Catholic." "Well, good, you're a Protestant." "I'm a Protestant too. Give us some food. Give us some beer." This was the beginning. This was November 5th. This was the beginning of trick or treat. It was. Okay. I'm filled with useless information. But in England, the fear of Catholics was endemic and deep. It reached a fever pitch in the 1680s when James II was discovered to actually be a Catholic. He had been raised in France, he converted to Catholicism, then he became King of England and Scotland, and practiced Catholicism. That freaked everybody out. And then he announced that Catholics would now be allowed into the military and could become officers. That really scared the army. So James, there was a revolt against James, the Glorious Revolution, and James was dethroned, and they got a nice Protestant instead. But at that time, when James was on the throne, a lot of Protestants again left England and said, geez, we've got a Catholic king, this is horrible. This is like worshiping Satan. Let's go, in fact, like they called the king the servant of Antichrist. So let's go to Boston and we can have trick-or-treating. The bigger picture for this was, in Europe, was that there had always been war between Protestants and Catholics. And usually the Catholics won. And the big deal was in the 1630s and 40s and the 30 Years' War, which was basically between Catholics and Protestants in Central Europe. It looked like the Catholics were going to win. And it looked like Protestantism would be stamped out. So a lot of folk in England said in the 1630s and 40s, we're the only holdout. We're going to be the only Protestants left, because Protestantism will be stamped out in Germany and maybe Denmark and maybe all of Scandinavia and the Netherlands, and it's going to us English people who will remain Protestant. So they began to think of themselves as the last hope for Protestantism against Catholicism. And that fed into the Puritans' settlements in the United States, or in the colonies rather. And Puritans, more than anybody, hated Catholics. Partly on the grounds that for Puritans, who were Reformed, many were Presbyterians, Christianity was largely a matter of inward feeling, of spirituality, of having faith. And that seemed to them to be contrasted to Catholic ritual. So the Puritans said, you're saved by faith. And they thought the Catholics were saying, you're saved by participating in the sacraments of the Catholic Church. And what you're feeling inside doesn't really matter that much. Just go to the Mass, receive it, say confession, receive absolution, get your babies baptized, and you're good. So the Puritans thought, that's superstitious. That's all external stuff. That's just external behavior. It doesn't really affect people's inward life and their spiritual life. So we can't tolerate Catholics. And Puritans, more than anybody, really rejected Catholicism. It was illegal in the colonies, in the New England colonies. If you were caught with rosary beads or saying a Mass, because there were some Jesuits kicking around surreptitiously, but if you were caught or saying the Hail Mary, you could be imprisoned, you could have your ears cut off, or you could be, even worse, sent to New Jersey, where I'm from. Or in some cases, hanged. The only exceptions to that were Maryland, for a while, which was founded by renegade Catholics from England, and even more so here, and a little bit in Rhode Island. But the Penn family welcomed Catholics. They still couldn't vote, and they couldn't hold public office. But it was the only place down in Rhode Island, in the colonies, where Catholics could build churches and worship openly. So Pennsylvania was regarded as weird and dangerous, because the first Catholic church was built in Philadelphia in the 1730s. And the church in Lancaster was built shortly thereafter. So the Puritan thing was Catholics are idolaters. They worship statues. And they blindly obey priests and think that if the priest says they're forgiven, then they're forgiven. And therefore Catholics are not to be trusted because they will sin and lie and steal and cheat, and all they have to do is go to confession and receive absolution from a priest. And that's no way to have a society. And the awakened people that we talked about last time, the people who were revived and born again, they also despised Catholics. So because they're not born again, they think you're saved by participating in the liturgy and the rituals of the Roman Catholic Church. And we all know that you're saved by going forward in an altar call and saying that you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. and having a born-again experience. So the awakened people also feared and despised Catholics. So the whole point of this is nobody liked Catholics in the United States, or the colonies rather, except a handful of real Catholics who lived in Maryland and some handful here. One estimate is that just about, in the colonies, 1% of the population of the 13 colonies was Catholic. Just 1%. But that was enough to destabilize everybody. They feared what the 1% would do. They said, just think, a century ago, they tried to blow up the king and parliament. Who knows what they'll do here? They're terrorists. And actually, Jesuits may have been terrorists, because the Jesuit order was given permission by the Pope to promulgate the doctrine that you could assassinate Protestant leaders. But that was not a sin. So Jesuits were spreading that throughout Europe and in the colonies. And that, of course, sparked fear. It's like the fear we have now of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But then it wasn't Al-Qaeda or ISIS, it was Catholics, particularly Jesuits. And then this was made worse by the French and Indian Wars in the early 18th century. Didn't end really until 1763 and the end of Pontiac's rebellion. Because the French in Canada were Catholic. And the Catholics had very successfully missionized and evangelized many Native American tribes, including the Ottawa, the Huron, and many of the Iroquois. So when war broke out against the French in Canada and their Native American allies, that was perceived as a Catholic versus Protestant war. Like, we're the Protestants down here in Pennsylvania and Virginia and New York and New England, and the Catholics are up there in Canada, and they're coming for us. So the French and Indian Wars were called a Protestant crusade. And to make it worse, the 13 colonies were sort of a Catholic sandwich, because there was the Catholic French up in Canada, and then the Catholic Spanish down in the Gulf region. And Spain at that time still controlled Florida and much of Alabama and Louisiana. So the 13 colonies were saying, we could get squeezed easily. If France and Spain ever decided, they could crush us from the south and from the north. So the French and Indian Wars were regarded as a Protestant defense maneuver. And in the meantime, as I said, there were some Catholics in the colonies, particularly here, particularly in Maryland. And some of them became quite wealthy. The Carroll family in Maryland, Carrollton County, Carrollton the town, Carrollton the college, Carrollton Street, Carrollton everything. And that was very disturbing, particularly for people in Pennsylvania. But those Marylanders, a lot of them are Catholic. A lot of them are rich Catholics. A lot of them are influential Catholics. And our border with Maryland is very vulnerable. They could come this way. And that was exacerbated by the fact that there were Catholics in Pennsylvania who were regarded as sort of fifth colonists. They probably weren't loyal to Pennsylvania. They were probably, in people's minds, they were probably loyal to the Pope. So they had to be watched closely. So all this is just by way of saying there was intense fear at the eve of the American Revolution of Catholic subversion. It was kind of fanciful and ridiculous, that 1% of the population would be able to take over and religiously and politically dominate the 13 colonies. But although in hindsight it looks ridiculous, people really believed it. And there was anti-Catholic pamphlets and ceremonies all over the place, particularly the American equivalent of Guy Fawkes Day, which was, it was just called Pope Day. That's when they burnt the effigies of the Pope and imbibed very generously. Now, for our purposes, one of the main triggers, and this is usually overlooked, but it's obvious. I mean, the colonists wrote about this all the time. One of the main triggers of the American Revolution happened in 1774. It was the Quebec Act. Parliament in England had issued a decree that the French Canadians, whom they had just conquered and had been absorbed into the British Empire, that the French Canadians in Quebec could openly worship. I mean, they'd been Catholic for generations. They were French. But that was illegal in most of the British Empire. But because England wanted to keep Canada quiet, they decided, well, we've got to give them something. So we'll give the French Canadians the right to worship openly in Catholic churches. And they can have the Mass whenever they want. And they can have priests, and the priests don't have to hide. Oh, and to sweeten it even more, we'll support the Catholic churches with tax money from Canada. They'll get a tenth of all the tax revenues. They'll get a tithe. So the Catholic church's flourishing will be assured by the government. So then that really freaked out the colonists, particularly the New Englanders, and said, hey, look, we just fought a bloody war against those French Catholics, the French and Indian War, and we won. And now look what England is doing to them. They're giving them preferential treatment. If you give Catholics preferential treatment, you let them worship, you give them money, they're just going to come back and attack us. And they're going to spread their Catholic religion throughout the West. They'll convert more Native American tribes. And at the same time, England forbade white settlement beyond about where Pittsburgh is now. So the colonists said, well, this is great. We can't settle the Ohio River Valley, but the Catholics can evangelize those tribes. So what we're going to be, again, a Catholic sandwich. Only before we just had Catholics to the north and Catholics to the south, now we're going to have Catholics to the west. So we're just going to be stuck on the eastern seaboard, clinging on for dear life. And because England is now giving permission for the Catholics in Canada to prosper and doing everything they can to please the Catholics in Canada, we're going to be in trouble. It's just going to be a matter of time until we have another war with Catholics in Canada. Only this time it won't be France backing the Catholics, it's going to be England backing the Catholics. That was crazy and fanciful, but it rang true to lots of people. So the Quebec Act was one of the 3 or 4 things that were called the intolerable acts that led to the Boston Tea Party. It wasn't just taxes on tea or earlier taxes on stamps. It was the threat of Catholic Canada and England's seeming favoritism towards the French Canadian Catholics. That was the primary thing that actually spurred the formation of the Sons of Liberty, the earliest sort of New England militia that spread to the other colonies, where colonists just organized and trained themselves on how to, in military maneuvers and drill, to prepare themselves if they ever needed to defend themselves against Britain. And that became, the ancestor of the Minutemen and Lexington and Concord. They very enthusiastically celebrated Pope Day. So the gangs in Boston that were burning the effigies of the Pope on Pope Day and inventing trick or treat, they became the backbone of the New England militias. They evolved very gradually from, well, we just don't like the Pope and we're going to have a drunken riot on November 5th, we're going to train to get serious, and we're going to stockpile cannon and gunpowder, and we're going to prepare ourselves, if we ever have to defend ourselves against Britain that seems to be favoring the French Canadians. So that brings our story forward to the beginnings of the Revolution. And to make matters more complicated, if they're not complicated enough already, very early on, the Continental Congress realized that it could not defeat Britain by itself. For one thing, it didn't have a navy. So we concluded we need an ally. Now, who hates Britain that we could ally ourselves with? Oh, France. That's a great idea. Let's send secret ambassadors to France to negotiate some kind of military alliance. And then the next step in their thinking was, oops, France is Catholic. We hate Catholics, therefore we hate France. And that created a lot of disturbance, political turmoil and disagreement within the Continental Congress. Should we or should we not negotiate with France to get some kind of mutual help treaty going? George Washington, who at this time, these opening moves towards ally with Catholic France were going on. George Washington was then still besieging Boston, but the British hadn't evacuated it yet. And he concluded, having seen the army he had just been given, that these guys are not capable of winning any war. You know, these are amateurs. They can't stand up to British regulars. So we really need the help of France. So what Washington did immediately was he forbade the celebration of Pope Day, which his troops were about to do. You know, they're getting ready, the effigy of the Pope, devil, and by then they threw in the effigy of George III. So they're going to burn the devil, the Pope, and George III all at the same time, and have a drunken carousing. And Washington just said, no more Pope Day, you can't do it. And there was a revolt against Washington from the army saying, no, Pope Day, look, we're Puritans, we don't celebrate Christmas. All we have is Pope Day. Pope Day is a good time. We have fireworks, we go trick-or-treating, we get drunk. But Washington said, nope, we cannot do that because if the French realize that we're celebrating an anti-Catholic holiday, they're not going to ally with us. So we've got to get over this anti-Catholic thing. So Washington was very adamant on stamping out any public display of anti-Catholic sentiment, which was unusual because he was just as suspicious of Catholics as anybody else. So it's just a necessity that we got to overlook the fact that they're Catholic, or else we're not going to win this. We really need their help, and we did. So that was when, again, this is a lot of trivial information. That was when the troops, next time it got near Pope Day in November 5th, to obey Washington, they moved it. Said, okay, we're not going to do it on November 5th. We're going to do it on October 31st, and we're going to, run around. By then, they controlled Boston. We're going to run around Boston. We're going to demand food and beer. It's our version of trick-or-treating, and hence that became part of the American ethos. It wasn't just that it was All Souls Day, which was a religious holiday. It was a secular feast that had its roots in burning effigies of the devil and anybody else you didn't like, and going trick-or-treating. So hence we have the lingering anti-Catholic sentiment inspired our traditions of Halloween. And of course, as you know, the treaty with France did materialize, thanks to Franklin and Jefferson and Adams and others, at which time all the colonies realized, we got to tamp down on this anti-Catholic stuff. We really don't like them, we really fear them, they really are terrorists, but we gotta overlook that for the time being. We'll allow it then, they'll help us win the revolution, and then they can go home and we won't have to see them again. So there was all sorts of legislation of preventing French Catholic soldiers from settling in the United States. Say, we want them to come over, we want them to fight for us, but if they think they're gonna stay here, they're wrong. They're going back to France as soon as this is over. And they're not gonna leave priests behind. We're not. So I'm stressing this to underline the fact that anti-Catholicism was a major, major factor, probably up there with no taxation without representation, triggering the revolution and fueling the enthusiasm and the fervor with which it was fought by the colonists. And not just the New England Puritans, it was everybody. Even the Episcopalians in Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, they feared the Pope just as much as anybody else. And they feared Great Britain's perceived preference for the Pope as much as anybody else. It was pretty universal. And as a matter of fact, when the war was over, most of the Catholic French went home. They didn't leave Jesuits behind. They didn't stay here. Interestingly, the German Hessians, who were mercenaries in the pay of Great Britain, fighting against the colonists, they liked it here. When the war was over, or more so when they had been captured and were prisoners of war, they were German. And in Pennsylvania, they discovered, ooh, there's German-speaking people here. And there's a lot of land. And the land is fertile. And the people who have captured us, because we're German, they were German, there was big prisoner of war camps in Lancaster and York. They're nice to us. So let's stay. And many of them did, stayed and married. So the German population in Pennsylvania expanded greatly because of the war. But the French, no. French said, they don't want us here. They're passing legislation to make us go home. And besides that, their food is terrible. They don't have delicate cheese sauces, no Béarnaise sauce, no frog legs. They eat chicken and waffles, and what the heck is that? And so the French did go home. And anti-Catholic sentiment resumed and continued almost till now. I think it's kind of gone. The fact that Biden was Catholic was, nobody made a big deal out of that. He almost turned it into a virtue to show that he was religious. And that was very different from the response to John Kennedy. And even Dan Brown's books don't sell. He's written more since the Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons. And all of them have Catholic villains in them, but they're not selling well anymore. I haven't seen sort of a Catholic horror movie lately, where the villain is some kind of crazy priest. The other instance of this was the Godfather movies, especially the third one, which was, again, where the Vatican was the enemy. And you don't see that in movies anymore. So maybe this anti-Catholic thing is really over, but for many people in the Revolutionary War period, the war was partly seen as a Protestant defensive move against Roman Catholicism. Catholics were regarded as suspicious, terrorists, can't trust them, never know what they're going to do, they might blow you up. And that was coupled with the theme that the colonies may be the last best hope for Protestantism, because Europe is becoming mostly Catholic ever since the end of the 30 Years' War. And Britain is untrustworthy. They're promoting Catholicism in Canada. So Britain isn't going to save Protestantism. it's up to us. So they had almost a messianic zeal. That it's not just to protect ourselves from Catholics, it's we gotta save the world from Protestantism. And that means we've got to use all the military resources we can get to oppose Great Britain. So, to summarize where we are now, fear of an Episcopal bishop was a primary motive. And then fear of Catholicism was even deeper. And meanwhile, the Great Awakenings were going on, solidifying a sense of trans-colony solidarity. We're all born-again Christians, we're all born-again Protestants, and that gives us a commonality, whether we're from Georgia or Massachusetts, whether we're born-again Episcopalians or born-again Congregationalists or born-again Presbyterians. So when you put all that together, and there's a powerful religious incentive, and there are more incentives that we're going to talk about in the next 2 times. One is, we haven't touched on yet much, is the Enlightenment. And particularly in the founding fathers from Virginia, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, all of whom had a different reason for fearing Catholicism. And it was, they thought it was just plain silly and superstitious. And they wanted pure reason to govern people's spiritual and religious lives. And that was also very prominent in Presbyterianism. But we'll talk about that next time. Right now, I'd like responses or questions about, yeah.
It makes a lot of sense to me what you're saying. I read a lot about the Revolution and Founding Fathers and stuff, and I've always understood like their deep philosophical and political connection and their opposition to the king and everything, and the taxation and all was real. But I've always wondered, how did they motivate a citizenry across the colonies to stay involved in that for like 8 years and keep slugging away at it?
Yeah.
It makes sense to me that they're, what was it that, that kept them going? So that it's just a way of thinking about it I hadn't come across before. Like,
yeah, religion is a powerful motivator.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in the history of humanity.
Yeah, because that strikes deep if you think your salvation is at stake, and that your religious health is being jeopardized, and the religious health of your entire society and your culture. Now that motivates people to pick up a musket, more so than, I think, there's a tax on tea.
Right, because at the citizen level, they're going to get taxed no matter what.
Right,
so
right.
Just who's it going to be?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So you say Maryland was sort of the home of Catholicism in the colonies, south of the Mason-Dixon line. Did they have what was their? Did they practice slavery? What was their Catholics' view on slavery?
Yeah, below the Mason-Dixon line, it was Episcopalians, well, except for Maryland, Episcopalians were the dominant group. And yeah, they legitimated slavery.
They as?
The Episcopal Church.
Okay.
Even in England, where Episcopalians are called Anglicans, but over here, the Episcopalian ministers, pretty much uniformly in the South, said, well, in the Bible, Cain, of Cain and Abel fame, Cain is cursed, and a black mark is put on his head, the mark of Cain. They said, well, that black mark, that must be skin color. That must be pigmentation. So that means that when God cursed Cain, God cursed in everybody who was dark-skinned. And that's sounds like a really far-fetched argument, but folk believed it. And also they thought that there's another school of thought that Africans were descended from Abraham's son Ham, who had been cursed because he saw his father naked. And it was thought that, and then Ham disappears and says he went south. So, okay, he's cursed, he goes south. That must be the ancestor of Africans, and they're still cursed. And then they threw that in with, and just look at their culture, it's primitive. They don't have an alphabet in Africa. They don't have anything like literacy. Their technology is Stone Age. So this shows that they are not beloved by God, and that they're very childish and primitive, and they need us to take care of them. So paternalism was strong in the South, which was why many of the founding fathers could say, no, all men are created equal. But then there's a unspoken asterisk there, except for the Africans. They're not. And that was just taken for granted by Episcopal clergy who, in the South, who developed a special catechism for African descended slaves, where the questions would be like, why are you a slave? And the answer is, because God hates me. That was kind of the expected response. Why does God hate you? Because my people are savage. So it's hard to believe now, but that was common. Presbyterian ministers in the South believe the same thing. I'm sorry to report. In fact, many Presbyterian theologians and ministers remained defenders of slavery long after the Civil War. I may mention my retirement deal in a seminary in the South, Presbyterian Seminary, Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. When I interviewed, they were talking about the benefits. Said, oh, here's a hidden benefit you probably won't get anywhere else. We have a cemetery for our faculty, and our faculty are buried according to their disciplines. So we've got like a plot for all the theologians. So we'll show you where you're going to be buried if you come here. So I said, great. And then I looked at who were going to be my cemetery mates for all eternity. And I was going to be at the feet of a guy named Reverend Thornwell, who up until he died in around 1900 had defended slavery as not only permissible, but mandatory according to biblical principles. That whites were mandated to enslave blacks. So I said, I'm going to be married at his feet. And I then very cleverly said, could I trade that for dental benefits? And that worked. I've got dental benefits, and I'm not buried there.
Were the Hessians Germanic Protestants?
Yes, they were. Some were German Reformed, and many were Lutheran. So they're the folk who ended up around here, augmenting very significantly. I saw a genealogical report that 1/3 of the Pennsylvania Dutch in south central Pennsylvania are descended from German mercenaries who were fighting for England during the American Revolution. And then got captured and liked it.
A little more information, please, about the separation that Henry VIII created. It seems pretty profound that they went from Catholic to perhaps fervently anti-Catholic. And was that because they were kind of shallow Catholics, or was it because the king told them to, or was it because of the law that said they had to be Protestant?
Yeah, it was all of the above.
Okay.
Henry broke with the Pope simply because he wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't give it. So he decided, the Pope's not going to give me a divorce? Well, I'll find somebody else who will. I'll find somebody else who will be the head of the church in England, if it's not the Pope. Who would that be? Oh, that would be me. And so he did force the bishops to give him a divorce. So he was strong-willed and brutal, and as you may remember, killed anybody who got in his way, Thomas More among them. But he was also clever. He realized, if all I do is get rid of the Pope and say, I'm the church ahead of the church in England and the Pope is not, but I keep the liturgy, I keep things that look like the Mass, and I keep most of the priests, and I keep most of the doctrine, and ritual on a Sunday morning looks the same, maybe nobody will notice. And he was right. A lot of folk in England said, well, okay, we got rid of the Pope, I'm not sure we liked him anyway, but our worship services are still kind of similar. You know, the High Church, Episcopalian. And meanwhile, he had, the really daring thing he did was to seize all the property of the monasteries. The monasteries in around 1520, when this started to happen, owned about, according to estimates, 1/3 of the land in England. So he seized it all and said, well, if I'm the head of the church, guess what? The monasteries are mine. And I can keep them or sell them or do anything I want with them. And so he did, and by selling them to the nobility, he gained their allegiance. He said, okay, now, this is great. We've just bought Downton Abbey. And it's ours now, and we don't want to give it back ever. So that meant that it was very unlikely that the nobility would ever want to revert to being Catholic. Because if they did, they'd lose all the stuff Henry gave them or sold them. So that did set the stage for all kinds of things. It set the stage for the rise of Puritanism, because there were Protestants who said, Henry's not going far enough. He just got rid of the Pope, but we'd like to get rid of all those Catholic rituals and all that Catholic superstition. And that led to the settling of New England and many of the other colonies.
Question on that, what was the sales pitch though to France, given the sentiment and then the you can't stay here? I mean,
yeah.
how did Franklin and others sell that, given, I mean, because you would think occupation would be
Yeah.
on their minds.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Washington and others, particularly Washington, wanted to tamp down on the anti-Catholic stuff. So he was hoping maybe the Catholics won't notice that maybe the French Catholics won't notice that we hate them. So there was a public relations thing. You know, get rid of Pope Day, stop anti-Catholic propaganda in the pamphlets and newspapers that were circulating in the colonies. And don't let the French know that we're going to pass legislation to forbid their soldiers from settling here. Of course, many of the French knew it, but the French wanted the alliance just as much as we did, because they had lost the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, to England. England had emerged victorious, and they wanted revenge. So, okay, now we have an opportunity to really stick it to England. So we're going to overlook the fact that those colonists don't like Catholics, and we will unite with them and help them. And I think that, the general consensus is, if that had not happened, the Americans would have lost. You know, it was the French Navy that basically won the Battle of Yorktown by pinning Cornwallis down and preventing him from getting resupplied. And you know, when that happened, the war was over. So without the French help, we probably would have lost.
Now, this is subject to what I supposedly learned in American history. I don't remember ever hearing anything about French regulars battling English regulars in terms of notable battles. sea side of it, yeah, the naval
Right,
side
right,
of it.
right, right, yeah.
Lots of that, but not the military on the ground.
It happened at Yorktown. Yeah, there were a lot of French infantry and cavalry participating in Yorktown. In fact, there were more French soldiers on the ground in Yorktown than colonists. And it happened in Newport and a few other places. But the French army entered late, and it entered just in time to take out the British, basically.
The Navy was already here because they were in the Caribbean.
Yeah, the Navy.
Yeah, and there were a lot of battles fought in it. Actually, from Britain, I'm getting out of the religion side of it into the military political side of it. Britain was more interested in hanging on to the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean than it was hanging on to the 13 colonies, because they were more productive. They were a cash cow, selling sugar. So and the French knew that, so there were a lot of the French and British navies dueled in the Caribbean, and they kept invading one another's islands.
To what extent, you touched a little bit on President Kennedy being Catholic, to what extent did that have an influence? Because I would not have thought it would influence much at all, and maybe his persona ever came any thing about him being Catholic. Could you expand on that a little bit about how that Catholicism influenced his election?
Yeah, everybody thought he was going to lose because he was Catholic, that he'd lose the South, he'd lose the Bible Belt, and that the only people who would vote for him were Catholics on the East Coast. If he was a master, I think, rhetorician and public relations guy. So he went out of his way to tell people over and over again, I'm not taking orders from the Pope. I'm going to make up my own decisions. But it was a big deal. A lot of Protestant ministers, high-profile Protestant ministers, urged Protestants not to vote for Kennedy on the grounds that we'd be subservient to the Pope, and we'd take orders from Rome. Norman Vincent Peale did that, who was, major television personality and had a big church in New York City. Was one of the highest profile Protestants around during Kennedy's campaign. And he argued that the Apostle Paul would condemn superstition, that Catholics were superstitious, and therefore the Apostle Paul would not want Catholics to vote for, would not want any American to vote for Kennedy. And then one of Kennedy's Catholic supporters said, I find the Apostle Paul to be appealing, but I find Peale to be appalling. So Kennedy won the public relations campaign.
I don't remember, because I was a child back then, how much he won by. Do you remember if it was a landslide or just a little bit? Or?
No, it was close.
It was close.
In fact, it could have been contested.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, because there was some rumors that dead people in Chicago had voted. And there could have been a recount. But Nixon graciously did not want that. He said, no, he seems to have won, I concede. He didn't want to split the country.
There have always been, in my lifetime, people arguing who should not have voted that did. Or
Yeah,
who
oh, yeah.
did vote that shouldn't have.
Right.
It's
Right.
just, it's become a theme, and recently it's become a big theme.
Yeah. If you lose, what else are you going to do?
Right.
Say, I didn't really lose.
I had a very large family, and the anti-Catholic rhetoric for Kennedy was common in my huge family.
Yeah. I was a child during during Kennedy's campaign, and a Baptist, but our Baptist pastor said he shouldn't have, he could have been sued. He could have lost tax exempt status. He told the congregation, I was like 6 or something, that if anybody voted for Kennedy, he wanted them to leave the congregation.
Wow.
Wow.
So that fear of Catholics runs deep. Yeah.
With all this tension between Protestants and Catholics, where did the Quakers fall with this?
Oh, their main concern was they wanted religious liberty. And they realized if they were going to have religious liberty, because back in England, nobody liked Quakers. Actually, but the standard punishment in England for being a Quaker was to have your tongue cut out. On the kind of sick grounds that Quakers like to be silent. So we'll help them out here. We'll prevent their ability to talk. But the Quakers wanted religious freedom, and they realized that if they were going to have religious freedom, they had to extend it to everybody. So in Pennsylvania, Quakers were actually dominant under William Penn. And they also had more noble reasons for wanting religious liberty, including religious liberty for Catholics, because their reasoning was religion should be sincere. And if you join a religion because the government is promoting it, that's not sincere. That's just going along with the herd. So they wanted freedom of conscience, and were daring enough to extend that to Catholics. Not entirely. The Quakers still said, when the Penn family controlled Philadelphia, still said Catholics can't vote or hold public office. But everything else they can do. They can have churches, they can worship in public, they can carry around rosaries, and that's fine.
Kind of building on that, looking ahead to the Constitutional Convention, there was this unity that had developed, from the Awakening.
Yeah.
But there was this anti-Episcopalianism and anti-Catholicism. How big of a struggle, and who was mostly behind the eventual establishment of the freedom of religion?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Virginians, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, were very enthusiastic about that. But so were some of the New Englanders, like Adams. And one of the reasons why they wanted religious liberty was because they realized, and we'll talk about that, why they wanted separation of church and state is because they knew, well, New England's largely congregational. The Middle Atlantic is a mix of Presbyterians and Lutherans and others, and the South is Episcopalian. If we were going to have a national religion, what would it be? So we can't do that. So they said, rather than saying Congregationalism or Presbyterianism or Episcopalianism is the religion of the nation, we just won't have a religion. Because whatever religion we would pick, we'd make somebody mad, and they wouldn't join the Union. So in order to have a union of the 13 colonies who were religiously different, you had to say, well, we're going to keep our hands off religion. We're going to have separation of church and state. And we'll talk about that our last time together.
Can I follow up with a question about the Quakers? You suggested that their origins were in the Awakening movement, which you think of as sort of fervently emotional. Now we see them as kind of sedate, quiet, and
Yeah.
Friendly persuasion movie kind of people.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, actually, they weren't the children of, I'm sorry if I gave that impression, they weren't descended from the Awakeners, they predated them. They go back to the 1660s and 1670s in England, and they always did practice silence. I don't know if you've ever been to a Quaker service, but for most Quakers, there's no sermon. The congregation just sits there until the Spirit illumines somebody or gives a word to somebody to stand up and say something. And sometimes it doesn't happen. People start looking at their watches, or introspecting, say, maybe the Spirit is saying something to me, and if I announce it here, I can go home. That really happens. I have, some of my ancestors were Quaker, and had their tongues cut out, and their ears cut off, and their noses cut off, in various colonies, till they went to New Jersey and nobody cared. So the Quakers were, you're right, they were more austere, contained, not given to enthusiastic outbursts, but the revivalists were.
At least in some areas, did not slaves get together for their own worship?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I haven't talked much about this religion of the slaves' contribution to the revolution, because it wasn't. Governor Dunmore in Virginia did a very, to the time, shocking but politically clever thing. He told slaves, now he was the British governor of Virginia, that if slaves would enlist in the British army in the colonies, they would be emancipated. He said, if you join the British army, run away from your plantations, and you and your family will be emancipated. So the slaves who were politically astute and organized